Welcome to Patrick Geary, who's joining me today to talk about his professional life, maybe some of his personal life as well. Um, Patrick Geary doesn't really need an introduction, but I will say that he is a much admired historian of the Middle Ages. We'll say in a cultural historian of the Middle Ages, um, who received his PhD from Yale University in 1974. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Under the supervision of Yaroslav Pelikan and Roberto Lopez. And he went on to positions at Princeton, Florida State University,
University of Florida.
University of Florida. I'm sorry, I have
Yes.
a colleague at FSU. UCLA, where he was the director of the Center for Medieval Studies, Medieval and Renaissance Studies, Notre Dame in Indiana, then back to UCLA, and then the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He has published numerous books and even more numerous articles and chapters. Some of my favorite books of his are Furta Sacra on theft of relics in the Central Middle Ages, and Myth of Nations about the the genesis of various population groups in Europe and their non-relation with their modern cognates, that is to say, the Franks and the French, and how this relates to modern ethno-nationalism in Europe. So I have a long list of questions. Thank you, first of all, for agreeing to be interviewed. I wanted to ask you, first of all, as a sort of question that will allow us to open up onto a variety of aspects of your life, who your most admired medievalist is.
Well, first, let me thank you for this opportunity to talk about these issues and myself. It's not a very frequent request that I receive. When I think about the medievalists that I have known and admired, there's a long list, obviously, from my own mentor, Robert Lopez, who was my official director. Pelikan, Yaroslav Pelikan, was the unofficial co-director. But also, I've been very influenced by people that I've taught, who've taught me, Leopold Génicot in Louvain, Georges Duby and Jacques Le Goff, who've been wonderful to me through their lives and through my career. But I think that the person I would talk about who has been so influential in my career and in my sense of what it is to be a professional historian is Herwig Wolfram, who was professor at the University of Vienna, the director of the Institute for Austrian Historical Research, and someone whose work has been enormously influential on my own work, but also his way of being a scholar and being a human being has been very influential as a model of a scholarly life well lived that I have attempted in my own inadequate way to emulate. I find him an interesting person, first of all, because he is positive. He is always looking on the bright side of things. He has a great sense of humor. He's much more athletic than I. He skied into his 70s. and perhaps into his 80s. He played basketball with a group of guys for years. It just when I studied with him every weekend, we would go hiking in the Rocky Mountains. Uh, he loved language. He loves to play with puns in English and other languages. He has a great appreciation for sound. And at the same time, he has this broad historical interest. You know, he has worked on very, very different kinds of things, which is something I've done as well. A series of fundamental works on intitulatio, the way that rulers designate themselves, what they call themselves, as a kind of not simply institutional study in formal diplomatics, but a way into mentalities, into how propaganda and ideology works within societies. He's written an enormous amount about the region of Salzburg and southern Bavaria and uh, the early Middle Ages in the Alp region, in the Austrian region. And then he was absolutely pioneering in his study of barbarian gentes, of peoples, with his book on the Goths and other things that he has written that really changed how everyone thought about what it was to be a people, a gens, in the early Middle Ages and late antiquity. And this breadth of scholarship is something that I have always appreciated, as well as the way he's been a mentor, a guide, uh, not for myself alone, but for so many people, particularly his students in Austria, but elsewhere, and his enthusiasm for young people and his life of a moral, responsible human being, deeply religious, but like me, a Catholic who is somewhat oppositional and skeptical, even while still connected to the tradition, a person who is a good family man with a stable family, children, grandchildren, and so someone that I admire enormously. And he has had this influence on me really since I first met him in 1971 when I spent the summer in Boulder, Colorado, studying diplomatics and paleography with him. And then through the years, our relationship developed. I was a visiting professor taking his place in Vienna when he had a period as a dean. I brought him to the US a number of times to teach my students. I visited him whenever possible in Austria. And we have spent many, many years knowing each other, our families, our children, our grandchildren. So this is someone who has been an extraordinary influence on me, and he continues to be.
Well, that's wonderful to hear, and it's interesting. Like there's a story about you and Georges Duby, um, the role of sort of almost happenstance in meeting these people who are so important in your life or become so important in your life that if you, I imagine that if you hadn't been in Boulder, you things might have been very different for you.
Absolutely. And the same with Duby. The first time I met him was my first year as an assistant professor at Princeton University. He was making his first trip across the United States. This was in 1975, spring of 1975. And at the time, Joseph Strayer had retired. Princeton had not been able to find a senior medievalist that they were satisfied with, so they had hired me. So I had to be his official host, and I entertained him and his wife, along with my wife Mary, as best I could. Then he said, if you're ever in Aix-en-Provence, you should look us up. At summer, on his recommendation, I went to a conference in Fonjo, uh, and Then my wife joined me. We were traveling in Provence. She became very ill. She had probably eaten some bad seafood and had vertigo, completely lost her equilibrium. And I knew no one. We were in Aix, and in desperation, I called Georges Duby. He immediately had an ambulance sent to get her from the hotel, put her in his physician's private hospital. For 2 weeks, Mary was in the hospital. I was there on basically a cot next to her because at the time she didn't speak French. And every day, Georges and Andre would come by to see us. They would take care of us. They would bring us reading material. They even did our laundry just and for no, and then he would take me out for walks to kind of calm me down as this young, very concerned husband who didn't know what was happening to his wife. And it was just a beautiful thing. There was no reason that he would do that. He was the great scholar at the Collège de France. His future would be at the Académie Française. And here is a completely unknown junior person that he just ran into at the States. And yet that was the kind of person that he was. Here was this young guy who needed some help, and he did. And at the end of the process, he took me aside and said, "Do you need any money? I can make you a loan if you need something." So it was an extraordinary beginning with another relationship with a person who, like Herwig Wolfram, was incredibly generous, enormously creative, and who was, as one article described, the most generous of people. And so when I talk about Herwig, I should really talk about Duby, but there's so many others who have been much kinder to me than I ever deserved and have helped me all along in my career. So this is just another example of the unexpected kindnesses that I've received through many, many decades from these marvelous people.
I think that I've observed to you in the past that um, you've been always being very good about trying to pay this forward to younger people, including myself. And uh, maybe in 30 years, somebody will be asking me about the important people in my life, and I will have the privilege of talking about Patrick Geary. Um, but I want to go even further back now.
Mhm.
So we've talked about gone as far back as 1971 when you met Herwig Wolfram. But even before that, uh, was there a formative moment really in your youth when it started to become clear to you that you wanted to study history as a career, or it was just something that you couldn't do without?
Well, as I think about that, I would say there is a formative moment. My secondary education, frankly, was weak. I went through a Catholic all-boys high school during the Sputnik generation, and you were supposed to study science. And in fact, this was not a particularly intellectual school. The order of brothers that ran it, I think, was more interested in football than even science. And this was Baton Rouge, Louisiana in the 1960s. And I went off to college with the intention of studying biology. I really was interested in what today would be called ecology or something along those lines. And I happened into a integrated honors program in my little Jesuit college in Spring Hill College, Mobile, Alabama, where I wanted to go because they had a good biology program. I wanted a Jesuit education, and there was something of a family tradition. My great grandfather had gone there in the 1850s. And so I found myself in this integrated program that combined history, literature, theology, philosophy, art history into an integrated kind of Western civilization great books program. Very, very intensive, massive reading for a group of about a dozen or so selected students. And I had never encountered anything like this. I barely read anything of literature or history in secondary school. My entire historical curriculum in high school had been one course in American history. It was mostly battle history. It was mostly the Civil War. And in 1964, the teacher actually said, "All right, boys, this time we're going to try to win it." It was an absolutely unreconstructed Southern approach to American history. So I was astonished as I began to read classical literature. And in the first semester was the ancient world, the second was the Middle Ages. And there was something about that world with its combination of familiarity, because one began to see the contours of contemporary society, culture, institutions, but also how very, very different it was from our world. And that combination of familiarity and distance that somehow seemed to me to resonate in complicated ways fascinated me and just drew me into that. And as a result, I determined to change my major from biology to history, although ultimately I took a degree in philosophy, but I had done as much history as philosophy. And also one of my teachers who had done his doctorate at Louvain, the Catholic University of Louvain, said, "Well, we really can't prepare you here for advanced graduate work in medieval history. So you need to go to Louvain. You need to enroll as a free student there and get some serious historical training." And oddly enough, my parents allowed me to get on a plane, even though I had not been admitted to this university and had very little understanding of how that would work, and flew off alone to Belgium in the spring of 1968, thinking that I spoke French, but actually my French was virtually non-existent. And got to Louvain. The letter rejecting me had come in the mail, but fortunately it came by surface mail, so it didn't get there until I was in Louvain, and talked my way into the university as a free student and spent the year studying with great medieval philosophers like Ferdinand von Steenbergen, also great historians like Leopold Génicaud, and a host of other people, and obviously improving my French to where it is functional, if not perfect. And that intensive study of medieval history, but also culture, that's what set me up for my career. So the combination of this extraordinary honors program in my little college and this intensive program in which I did essentially all of the work that one would do as a history major in the first year and of the licentiate in Louvain, as well as medieval philosophy, as well as Latin, as well as other areas, became what made it possible for me then to survive in a powerful graduate program such as Yale's Medieval Studies program.
That's wonderful to have all that background. And even now, when you tell that story, you've told it to me before, but there are always different details that we get in each retelling. So
None of them true, probably.
yeah, well, I know that in the past, when I've asked you about your retelling to tell this story, you've demurred a little bit in saying that, well, there's all this self-fashioning that goes into origin stories. Very appropriate comment for Patrick Geary. But it is interesting nonetheless. Now, I was wondering, in connection with that, you mentioned your parents letting you get on this plane. I was wondering if you could tell me more about your parents,
Well,
and what they were like and what they thought about all of your
well,
interests.
my parents were both from Louisiana, and I many generations, and uh, my father's family were from New Orleans, and he grew up in New Orleans. His mother was an Acadian. Her native language was French. She was born on a plantation between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, moved to the city, as we call it, around the turn of the century. She was born in 1880. She married a second generation Irish immigrant who was a builder architect in New Orleans. And my father grew up with four brothers and sisters in the city. Uh, he graduated from high school in 1928, just in time for the Depression. His father was highly leveraged in building and lost everything, and I think went into a deep depression. So my father had to support the family, uh, who were in dire circumstances, ultimately having to live in rented places of buildings that they previously owned, and finally having to move in with relatives. So he was the sole bread earner. There was no question of college for him. He had a long career with what was then Southern Bell, that was the regional division of American Telephone and Telegraph, as a middle manager. He was sent around as a young man. He was sort of the person to go in and fix problems. And at one point, he was sent to Mississippi, and that's where I was accidentally born, although I consider myself a Louisianian. And the one thing I can't forgive my parents for having not crossed the border when my mother was due. My mother's family were also French Irish. Her mother's family were a combination of post-Napoleonic period French immigrants to Louisiana. Her father was born on a wheat farm in Kansas. His father had been an immigrant, actually coming from Canada into the US and homesteading in Kansas. She went to university in somewhat unusual in 1928. She went to Louisiana State University, completed a degree in journalism, found it during the Depression very hard to work as a woman journalist, ended up working for the public health department in the state of Louisiana under the mentorship of an extraordinary pioneer in public health nursing, Emma Morin, who was someone who deserves a biography someday. But she was then working informally as a statistician, and ended up going to Western Reserve, what is now Case Western Reserve, to do a master's degree in public health statistics, and then was loaned by the state of Louisiana to the state of Mississippi, which had no department or Bureau of Vital Statistics. They had no idea who was born, who died, what illnesses, and so forth. So her job was to set up a formal Bureau of Vital Statistics in the state of Mississippi. She had met my father years before in Louisiana. They reconnected, married there. My brother and I were born in Jackson. And then when I was one, my father was able to get a transfer back to our state of Louisiana and grew up there. My father was not particularly interested in history. He was not an intellectual. He was a man of great faith, and unusual for a Southern man born in 1909, uh, uh, extraordinarily devoid of the typical racial prejudices that one saw in the Deep South. My mother, having been a kind of Roosevelt woman, a public health worker, also had a very different approach to society and to life. And so we were quietly raised rather differently from most young white children in South Louisiana. Our relationships with Blacks in Louisiana, while still within the realm of traditional patriarchy, were very different from that of the people around me. And we grew up in this rather different kind of world. My mother was intellectually ambitious. She probably would have loved to have been either a nurse or a physician, although her work in the public health department was important. And she was also very interested in culture, in literature, and indirectly in history. You don't grow up in Louisiana without a strong sense of the past, often invented and often imagined, but still ever present. Uh, Faulkner said in the South, the past isn't gone, it isn't forgotten, it isn't even past. And so growing up in that world, the past was very present in terms of family stories, families' histories, families' myths. But my mother simply wanted intellectual opportunities for her sons. And she was highly supportive of whatever I did. She didn't care what it was. She wanted me to get the best education that I could and to pursue that however I wanted to do it. So neither of them had any interest in my being a professor or a professional historian. My brother became a physician. Uh, my father used to joke that he wanted us to go to college and he oversold it, so it seemed that we never left. But basically, they wanted us to be decent, good people. They wanted us to be people of faith. They wanted us to be independent, taking care of our families, and leading a happy life. And beyond that, how we did that was very much up to us. They were simply there to support us.
That's lovely to hear. And I feel like beyond the intellectual encouragement, the your comment about them raising you slightly differently from the people around you would have given you all sorts of courage in terms of going off and doing these strange things like studying at Louvain and doing a PhD in medieval history. It's not something that most people do, but you were already used to not doing what other people thought you should do. Um, so that's very interesting. And your final comments about Louisiana and the sense of history leads directly into my next question, which is whether being from Louisiana and having this weight of history upon you has given you any particular insight, done anything useful for studying the Middle Ages or understanding Europe more generally?
Well, certainly, first of all, Louisiana, South Louisiana, French Louisiana, sugar Louisiana, as opposed to cotton Louisiana, Anglo-Saxon Louisiana, Protestant Louisiana, is a very different world. It was very different back then, and to an extent, it still is. Uh, it's French, it's Catholic, but of course, the Acadians were settled. My family moved to l'Acadie in 1668. This is not the France of the Enlightenment. It's not the France of the French Revolution. It's a very different France. And so and that was taken down to Louisiana after the British ethnic cleansing of the region. And So this is a different kind of cultural world, which is not really, when we think of France, we think of what France is today. This was a different France that was closer in some ways to perhaps the Middle Ages. Acadians in Louisiana are probably the closest America ever had to a true peasantry. They didn't own slaves. They worked their own lands. They lived largely off of what they produced. They were largely autonomous. It's a very different kind of culture. So that's a big background. But more specifically, you don't come from a family that's been in Louisiana since at least the 18th century without a lot of stories about uh, how people came to Louisiana, stories, of course, about the Civil War. I had ancestors who were Confederate officers, stories of terrible racism, of really dark aspects of Southern existence. And that, given my own upbringing, the dissonance between these stories that were laudatory about this lost past, recognizing at the same time the inadequacies and the problems of this certainly gave me a sense of the importance of history and also the importance of separating out these myths that can be so powerful and frankly toxic. And at the same time, I was writing my book on phantoms of remembrance. I was editing the memoirs of my great great aunt, who was born in Louisiana in the 1850s, grew up during the Civil War. Her father was a Confederate engineer officer. Her family lived in no man's land between Union and Confederate lines. She was an absolutely unrepentant white supremacist, and in around 1900 began to write her memoir, basically of her early childhood through her marriage in the late 1860s. I edited this, and as I edited it, doing multi-archival studies to control her stories, I could see, on the one hand, the extraordinary ability to remember very, very small details, often keyed by objects, because a cousin gave me access to her papers and the objects that she grew up with, but also complete confabulations that had taken place between the 1860s and 1900 as a result of her own experiences. So the way that her memory was influenced by the subsequent aspects of her life, her relationship with her father, whom she adored, her relationship with her mother, which was extremely difficult, her place within New Orleans society, and this sense of memory as creative, as imagined, with points of connection to materiality and to events, but always transformed, reconstructed, reshaped, uh, uh, gave me a strong sense of this process of what it is to speak the past for a present. And I think that that kind of mythology of the past certainly influences how I approach my work as a professional historian, looking at a much more distant past, one that I'm not as emotionally engaged in, but which also has traces of this process of creative memory and of myth making progressively across time.
That's fascinating. I am incredibly impressed with your ability to cross from your family's personal history treated in such a serious way, um, back to 1,000 years before, and carry over some of the same skills and the same perspective. Um, And sometimes I tell my students that, it doesn't matter what you end up doing in history. If you do it well, it will always serve to teach you something new, and that you'll be able to apply somewhere else. Um, and that sort of that I can continue on with that theme of learning from one thing and or one person and carrying that onto something else. I wanted to ask you, you've worked in a number of different institutions, whether on a as a so-called permanent member of that institution or a visiting member of that institution, but you've had many, many colleagues, and one of your colleagues we've already mentioned was Herwig Wolfram, but I would like to know whether you have any other colleagues you'd like to mention who had a particular influence on you. They don't necessarily have to be medievalists, but who may
Well,
have taught you something.
I can certainly, I've learned an enormous amount from so many of my colleagues through the years at every institution in which I have taught, either long term or even short term. And it's almost unfair to single out one over another. I could think, for example, of Helmut Reimitz, who's been the medievalist at Princeton University and is now going back to Vienna, actually, to the chair that Herwig Wolfram had held many years ago, as someone who's been very influential in my life. But I would say that going further back, and someone who's not a medievalist, I think that the person I would single out is Karl Schorsky. Karl was professor of modern history at Princeton University back in the 1960s and 70s when I was an assistant professor there. Karl is the author of this great book on fin de siècle Vienna. And Karl was a cultural historian who read culture for political purposes. And what I have always found so fascinating in his work and what I've learned from him on personal basis, as well as sitting in on some of his seminars and especially reading his work, is the deep interconnection between cultural production, uh, architecture, art, music, and so forth, and the social and political environment in which they are generated. Not that there's simply a one-to-one correspondence. It's not a kind of crude Marxist infrastructure, superstructure, but nevertheless, one reads a building, one reads a city plan, one reads an operatic score, and one understands that this is something that is generated within a particular world, and it's a way into that world. And I would say that this insight, although I've never been the historian that Karl Schorsky was, has been always an inspiration to help me think about. You said I'm a cultural historian. Well, I am, but culture is not separate from the fabric of society, from what people eat to how politics work. And I find this approach of Karl, this seamless weaving of cultural traditions, of the built environment, of ephemeral things such as sound, into an understanding, a complete understanding of a society, absolutely inspirational. And although I have never achieved it, it's always been something that I have greatly admired. And he too was a wonderful human being. And I must say that I find that, there are good people and there are bad people in our profession. And there are some people who are very good scholars, but it has been at a cost to their humanity. And yet, in my experience, those people at the very top, people like Duby, like Le Goff, like Wolfram, like Shorsky. Somehow, to me at least, these are people who have managed a synthesis of a life well led, decent human beings wanting to make the world a better place, care for others, and brilliant scholarship.
Well, uh, I wish that I could take that little piece there and excerpt it for my doctoral seminar. That would be a very important thing for them to hear. Um, now, this may end up being repetitious. I'm not sure, um, given the fact that you've mentioned a lot of names already. But I was wondering if you could name. We've talked about a medievalist that you admire, about colleagues who have influenced you. Can you talk about a favorite work of history that you, not necessarily your favorite, but a favorite? Because I know it's always hard to say that it is the top of a particular pyramid.
That's very difficult to say, of course. I would say that Karl Schorsky's Fantasiacle Vienna is something that I read and reread with great wonder. Uh, Among medievalists, it's hard to read medieval history without being constantly critical. We read other people's work with a critical eye. It's hard to read in our profession just for pleasure. It's easier to read uh, 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 historical work about periods that we know less about than uh, our own. In fact, I was once teaching a seminar on historical methodology, critical reading, and so forth. And at the end, a student said, well, Professor Geary, you have ruined history for me because I loved reading history. I am passionate about reading history. And now I can't read historians without looking for their evidence, their argument, the problems with this, how are they using their material, and so forth. You've taken all the pleasure out of it. Well, that's, I hope, not entirely true. But one book that had a great influence on me as an undergraduate was Wilhelm Levison's great book, England and the Continent in the 8th Century. Partly perhaps because I knew very little about England or the continent or the 8th century. But I was just astonished at the way this scholar was able to talk about these two worlds as part of the same world, the kind of detailed analysis that this great German scholar, refugee to Britain, who then could continue his scholarship, how he worked. He, because it was a kind of very serious scholarship, he's not hiding how he did it. He's showing his sources, his material, his incredible breadth of knowledge. And that book really inspired me. It was not the sort of thing that one gives to undergraduates normally, but that was probably the first time I saw what real continental scholarship at its highest level meant. And so I would, of all the many, many books that I've read, I think that I would go back to that one. But I could make the same argument about so many other books that I've read and just felt at the end a sense of awe at the way that these scholars have been able to summon into presence a world. Uh,
I,
another another book that I have really loved, I read at Louvain, was Lucien Febvre's collection of reviews, Combat pour l'Histoire. And this is not a history book. This is a broad range of books, of reviews in which he's showing how he understands history. And I keep coming back to his judgment that writing history is a powerful effort of erudition and imagination to recreate the whole lived experience of the past. And this is also a vision of what the ideal historical study should do, something that I have never accomplished, but it continues to be an ideal in my mind. And then Marc Bloch's Apologie pour l'Histoire, incomplete, written shortly before he was murdered by the Nazis, but a reflection on what it is to do history. Begins with his son saying, "Dites-moi, papa, à quoi sert l'histoire? What good is history?" And he's trying to tell us that. And his combination of engagement in the present and his understanding of the difference between the present and the past is terribly important. And too many historians, I'm afraid, simply try to carry out their own political visions by projecting them onto the material that they study. And this is something that I think that Bloch was very aware of the dangers of so-called lessons of history that somehow take the past and drop it into the present, but then also we distort the past to make it look like the present so that we can claim that the past is repeating itself. And this very important warning at a crucial moment in European history continues to inspire me. And I go back and reread these books frequently.
Well, that's wonderful. I have to say that Apologie pour l'Histoire uh, is often assigned as an undergraduate book, but I don't feel that it speaks to undergraduates very well. I feel like it's a book that um, gains gains as you progress in this field, because it's written by somebody who has already had a reasonably long career and has started to reflect on things in an extremely serious way, that uh, undergraduates can always glimpse what's behind what is being said. So I I really appreciate you saying that it's something that you reread, because I think it's one of those books that says something different to you, and perhaps more each time that you read it. Um, Now I'm going to change tack, um, and go from intellectual matters to service. Research to service is, we have a trinity of things that we were supposed to do in our job: service, teaching, and research, each at a certain percentage. But one of the things that, another thing of the many things you have excelled at in your career is administration, whether you were director of the CMRS, or you administered several very large projects over the course of your career. You had an administrative role, I believe, at Notre Dame as
I
well.
directed the Medieval Institute, yes.
Yes. So how I've asked you this before, um, how did you, well, I guess, how will I phrase this question more elegantly? When you were offered the initial position at the CMRS, you know, what led you to believe that it was a good idea for you to be an administrator? Where did you get your enthusiasm, your interest in in leading things larger than your own personal research projects?
Well, I think that I had developed an interest in multiplying, expanding one's impact through organizational processes. A professor can teach a class and reach 20 or 30 or 50 people. He can direct some dissertations, can write a book that maybe 100 people will read. But the multiplier effect of helping other people advance their work, it was something that I had seen from Herwig Wolfram, director of the Austrian Institute, and others, to see how that could be effective. And so the possibility of directing an institution whose purpose is to aid a lot of people, faculty as well as graduate students, to better understand and project an image of the world that we study, seemed to me a very appropriate kind of thing. In one's career, not everyone, but at least for me, I felt like I've moved from just my own work, then to mentoring students, but then at a certain point expanding to see how I could enable other colleagues' careers. And in terms of leadership background, my very brief and inglorious period as an Army officer taught me something about what it means to lead. But I also had an interesting experience. The first job I held working in the Tourist Commission in Louisiana, I was in the mailroom, and they brought some guy in who was going to head the mailroom. And he had a college degree. And so the first thing he did was to empty a storage room, put a desk in there, and say, I am a manager because I have a degree. And at the time, as a kid, I thought this is pretty ridiculous. And I've come to see people who take an office as a privilege as opposed to a duty. And the difference between an office and an honor is very important. And I've always thought that an office as a director or a chair or something like that is a duty. It is a service. It's not something that builds one's own career, but it is a way to stop and enable other people's careers for a while. And certainly running these centers, I don't think I'm the best administrator, and I certainly know that I have significant weaknesses. But doing this was satisfactory to me because I felt like I was able to advance worthwhile projects that other people were doing. I have largely dodged the role of department chair. At the Institute for Advanced Study, everyone takes a turn or used to as the executive officer. So I did that at the Institute, but that's a pretty light job. The job of a department chair, I find, is extremely challenging because the department chair has to find a way for the least productive, least useful member of the department to still do something. A director of a research center like UCLA Center or Notre Dame Center can focus on the most capable people in that center and send resources their way, help them organize questions and projects. And so a research center is as strong as its strongest people. A department is as strong as its weakest people. And I've always dodged that role. I don't think people wanted me to be a chair because I can be rather difficult and demanding. But as a director of a research center, I found that helpful. It was also very helpful that my wife has had a career as a very powerful senior executive in healthcare, and she has mentored me in how to run complex organizations. So I owe a lot of my success, to the extent that it was successful, to Mary and the way that she was able to help me think through questions of personnel, of budget, of organizational questions, and so forth. So I found that these were good roles. On the other hand, of course, they really eat up your time. There's no such thing. You're given a part-time course release or whatever, but essentially, if you're doing the job right, you are working full-time to help other people. And that my productivity as a scholar certainly declined during those years because there was simply so much to do, particularly at UCLA, where we had an earthquake in my first year. We had to abandon our building. We were stuck downtown in an office tower, and I was supposed to run a center from the periphery for 3 years, and that was rough. And there were financial issues in the university. It was a time of retrenchment and crisis. So those were challenges. But I think that if you have the ability to do it, for a time, it's a good thing to do, but you have to absolutely understand that you're doing it to help other people move things forward. At UCLA, I think the most enduring thing that I was able to create was something that is the California Medieval Seminar that continues now many years later to bring faculty and graduate students from all over the state together to discuss pre-distributed papers, to get to know each other, to network, and to advance careers. And that's the kind of thing that I think can make a difference. It allows people who are isolated institutions to come together in a supportive environment, to work closely together, and to advance in their careers. It's one thing that we did that I think was significant. You were part of an important project at UCLA, which was the St. Gall project. I was not director at the time, but I was the co-director of that project with Bernie Fisher. And that was a possibility to do a number of things, to get money to hire graduate students and train graduate students. There are a number of excellent students who could not have come to UCLA had they not done that. It was also a way to combine scholarship with training. And it was to create a way of doing research in a group effort that would have a wide influence beyond the confines of UCLA or a small group of scholars. Sadly, UCLA has dropped the ball and no longer supports that in the way that they should. And that's one of my regrets in my career. But that was a program to try to organize this. Currently, I'm the co-principal investigator of a big European Research Council project that is combining genomics, historical research, anthropology, and archaeology to study the Carpathian Basin in the 4th to 9th centuries. There again, I think the real output will be the number of young PhDs who can go on to careers as a result of this, and opening people's minds to thinking differently about the natural sciences and the humanities as all part of a continuum. So those are things that I think are worth spending time on, even if it means maybe another book doesn't get written or another paper doesn't get researched.
I think, yeah, your work on the genes project is something that I've mentioned to my graduate students a number of times because of the how amazingly diverse the group of researchers you've brought together is, and how it allows you to go so much further with some of these questions than ever would have been possible under a model, even if the techniques had been there, the model that existed, say, 40 years ago, when those sorts of large collaborations between scientists and historians and linguists and all those other people just weren't happening. Um, now, that's great. I want to continue. Maybe ask you whether there's a project. We've talked a lot about your successes, and one of the things that you mentioned just recently was a regret about the St. Gall project not being as being as durable as you had hoped. And I think that there are an awful lot of people who have worked on digital humanities projects who would say similar things. I know that when I talked to Courtney about the St. Gall project, he basically took it as proof that you shouldn't spend a single moment of your time doing anything that related to the digital humanities, which I think is maybe a bit too pessimistic a reading of the outcome. But is there a project, whether it was something to do with research or something to do with teaching, something that didn't turn out the way that you'd hoped, didn't go well, and whether there was any lesson you could draw from that?
Well, there are a lot of projects that don't go the way one expects, and that can be a good thing because if you know what the end point is, then it's not really worth doing the work to get there. Unfortunately, too much scholarship that is really ideology masking itself with footnotes assumes that the end is known from the beginning, and it's really an argument to prove what one has already assumed. Uh, I think that Clifford Geertz once characterized uh, uh, I forget what they called it, academic scholarship, but something of the great effort to prove the obvious. Uh, so that's a problem. If you're actually doing scholarship, you don't know where it's going to go, and that's part of the fun. And so you can be sidetracked or you can be surprised. With our genetic project, I really thought that there would be no distinction in terms of genetic ancestry within certain populations in northern Italy, their material culture, and their social status. I was wrong. There is something very strong about continued cultural transmission within kin groups. It's not complete, it's not a biological thing per se, but there is more persistence that actually means it's a cultural practice. It's not a biological practice. So that was a surprise. One of the minor, but I think classic cases was when I was working on my book on Provence in the late Merovingian period. I spent some time in Torino, in Turin, in the archives, working with the Chronicon Novaleccense, this rotulus chronicle written in the first third of the 11th century. That's a fascinating text, which again is this combination of myth, of history, of imagination of the past. And I had written a fair amount about that. And I was in the archive looking at this Rhodolus, but also looking at the other manuscripts from Novalesa. And there is an enormous Tour Bible from the 9th century, one of these really large format folio Bibles. And I noticed that many of the margins had been cut out. So there were long strips, long, narrow strips from the sides of the manuscript that had been cut out. And then they were shorter but fatter pieces from the bottom of the manuscript that were cut out. Well, I looked at the Chronicon, which was a draft. It was never put together into a codex, and thus it's a Rhodolus, and it's scraps sewn together, some long and narrow, some shorter and fatter. And I thought, aha, I bet I know where they got the parchment. And so I spent several weeks in Torino. I even got a grant from the American Philosophical Society to go with my ruler and try to show that this manuscript, which we're not certain was a Novalese in the 11th century, it probably was, but it's not entirely clear, was the material source for the Chronicon, which was written at a time that the monastery was being reestablished, probably did not have a very strong scriptorium, and so they were cannibalizing books. Didn't work. I could never show that any fragment from the Chronicon fit precisely into the Bible. It was a lot of fun. It was a great experience. It was a learning lesson in the materiality of manuscript production. But no, that was a false direction. But these projects, and here I would disagree with Courtney, you have to think about the process and the end result. I'm very sorry that the St. Gall plan is no longer up and functioning the way it's supposed to. People who took part in that process learned a great deal. Manuscripts were digitized at a time when they would not have been, and those are still available. People have gone on to very interesting careers as a result of that project. And so the process itself was valuable, even if the product at the present no longer exists in the way that we wanted it to. So, this takes me back to this idea that is it's Hugh. I guess it's Hugh of Saint Victor, but it is the epitaph of Father Leonard Boyle, the great Vatican librarian who was framed and expelled from the Vatican Library in a really ugly, vicious court intrigue, but a wonderful man, a wonderful Franciscan priest, and buried in San Clemente. And his epitaph says, Omnia disce videbus poste ad nihil esse superfluum. Just learn everything. It'll turn out to be useful. So you learn everything and somehow it all comes together. And that, I think, is a pretty good motto.
It's interesting that you bring up Leonard Boyle because he was a very important person for John Osborne as well, who I previously interviewed. So the world of people who work on the early Middle Ages or cultural history of the Middle Ages is relatively small, and Leonard Boyle touched a lot of people. Now, his posterity is guaranteed, and I wanted to ask you whether there was one of your works, an article, a book, a chapter, that you would be most pleased to find, if you could see into the future, was still being read and used 100 years from now. Not necessarily that you most historians write for today, for their colleagues, for their students, for people a little while down the road. But is there something that you'd like to, you would be most pleased would have a longer life than that?
Well, uh, my mentor, Robert Lopez, wrote his early books in Italy in the 1930s on Genoese uh, commerce, on the working for the Genoese notarial archives. And these were published in the 1930s on really terrible paper. And I remember sitting in his seminar once, and he held his seminars in his office, and he would jump up and down and pull books off the shelf and interrupt people. It was a very interactive, exciting way of teaching, which I loved. And some people were horrified because they wanted to do their little presentation and he would constantly interrupt them and sometimes reduce them to tears. And he didn't mean to, he was just enthusiastic. But he said, I know I didn't write for the ages, but I had hoped that my books would outlive me. But because they were written on this acidic paper, they're disintegrating faster than I am. And I think that that's a good lesson. I don't think we write for the ages. If someone edits a manuscript, you say, well, in 100 years, they'll be using that edition. Well, maybe they will, but maybe they won't. We look at MGH editions, and often now it's to criticize and to say, well, the MGH hid the reality of the manuscripts from us by editing them. So editions, critical editions, are probably not as eternal as many people had thought they would be. And as you say, what we're doing is trying to translate the past for our present. We don't really write for the ages, even though some people think they do. So I'm going to have to say that if people are reading my work in 100 years, they're not going to be medievalists. They will be historians of the late 20th and early 21st century culture and historiography. And they might be reading my work in ways that I would never have imagined, more like Karl Schorsky looking at turn of the century Vienna and reading texts to understand the past, the world in which the author wrote, rather than saying, oh, now we really understand medieval relic thefts, or we understand Provence at the end of antiquity in the early Middle Ages. So, no, I think that I hope that in 100 years from now, the students of my students who may not even know that I ever existed will be doing really interesting, exciting work. And it was only possible because I found the funds to support my graduate students. They went on to teach other graduate students. They went on to teach others. And I think that ultimately that is our legacy is what we pay forward. It's not the words that we write. And the as much as we think they are enormously brilliant and important at the time that we write them.
Well, I'm still hopeful that somebody will read your Sacred Commodities in 100 years in French and be inspired to go and look up what's new about the study of relics, because that would be a great way of paying it forward as well. Um, I, since we're thinking about the future of medieval history, maybe you could talk to me more generally about where you see medieval history going. It's changed a lot since you received your PhD in 1974.
Mhm.
How do you feel that might change in the next 25 or 50 years?
Well, historians are good at the past. We're not very good at the future. And whatever happens is not going to be what we expect. There's also the issue, I remember years ago when Lawrence Stone, who was a great British historian at Princeton and the senior towering figure in the department, was talking in the 1970s about how the profession was in such trouble and difficulty. And a visiting scholar from France simply said, "C'est son âge." Uh, and so at my advanced age, I perhaps uh, more concerned about the future than you would be or your students might be. I think that in terms of scholarship, we are going to see a greater emphasis on materiality and material culture of manuscripts, of material, of buildings, of archaeology, because we have access to that, particularly through digital and uh, technological advances. It used to be that the only people who could do manuscript work were people at incredibly wealthy institutions or people who were independently wealthy who could afford to travel around the world at great expense and visit these institutions and manuscripts. Now, increasingly, because of things like the St. Gall Project and many others, one can access enormous amounts of material uh, at no cost from almost anywhere. So I think there's a return to manuscripts that's very important. And it's also going to be true of other kinds of the materiality of scholarship. I hope that the kind of work that the young people in our Histogenes project are doing, which is uh, to erase this two cultures divide, will continue, and that a future generation of people interested in the medieval world will be more comfortable with the kinds of genomic, isotopic, uh, paleoclimatological, and other processes which historically were outside of the purview of those of us who were trained essentially as philologists. Uh, Herwig Wolfram once said there are two kinds of historians, those who work with a pen and those who work with a shovel, meaning philologically trained historians and archaeologists. But increasingly, these are coming together, and we're also bringing in the test tubes and the Illumina sequencers. And so I hope that there will be a blending. I'm very concerned about the possibility in the future of getting proper formation in education. Certainly in my country, we are in free fall in terms of uh, support for this kind of work and also a wider community's interest in this kind of work. Perhaps we're back to the world that I lived in the 60s when all that mattered was science. We're told that STEM is all that matters now. And then AI comes along and we're told we don't need programmers because AI will program for us. So we don't know where we're going, but we're certainly not going to medieval history. So I think in North America, you're perhaps better off in Canada for the time being. But I think that the opportunities to train and to have a career doing the kind of work that you and I do is going to be, frankly, less and less of an option. We may be back to a world in which people will study medieval history with great interest and enthusiasm and then find a job, a career, a profession elsewhere and be educated, enthusiastic, non-professional scholars. And I try to tell my students when I was training people and people were coming to talk about graduate work, is there anything else you can do? And if so, do it as a career. So I think that this is going to be, we're going to be in a period of significant retrenchment professionally. And I, I hope that I'm wrong, but it seems to me that this is going to be a great challenge. At the same time, as people realize that AI and STEM don't answer questions about meaning, perhaps there will be a turn. I had a wonderful student who unfortunately died a few years ago. I taught at Yale when I was a TA, Ashton Carter, who did a degree in medieval history and physics, went on to do as a Rhodes Scholar, a PhD at Oxford, and became the Secretary of Defense of the United States. And he was very adamant that he wanted people to know that he had studied medieval history. And he said, I studied physics to understand how the world works, and I studied medieval history to understand why it works. And I hope that humanistic studies, whether history, philosophy, or other conceptual fields, will continue to work with other disciplines so that we can understand meaning and value. But currently, at least in my country, this is not a priority that is supported by public institutions. So where are we going? I don't know. Why be a medieval historian? You don't do it because you expect a career, wealth, praise, glory. Georges Duby once told me, I'm not an historian because I want to be. I'm an historian because I must be. And that's really ultimately the only justification that I have, and is probably the only justification that anyone should have. It is not a rational career choice. It is a necessity if that's the kind of person that you are.
I think that it certainly resonates with me um, as a piece of advice. And I guess now that we've looked to the future, trying to predict what will happen and give advice accordingly, I wanted to ask you as a final question, and this may happen, it may not, but given 25 extra years, which would make you, I don't know, 102 or something like
Something
that.
like that, yes.
And assuming that you continue to do research, what are the sorts of things that you would ideally like to tackle?
Well, if I were to live to 102, if my mental faculties continued,
Hmm.
and I would say if my mental faculties improved from where they are now, there would be a variety of possibilities. You know, one factor is that the human brain undergoes changes across time. The powerful creative impulses of youth are most obvious in mathematics. You know, if you what you haven't done by the time you're 30, you're never going to accomplish. And our field is longer, but later your brain works differently. And that's simply a biological fact. But on the other hand, it can do other kinds of synthetic work and creative work that is not what one does in one's 20s and 30s and 40s. So let's assume that I could do something like that. Well, if I were faced with another 25 years, I would be interested in continuing the kind of work that I've been doing with this genomic history. That would mean more archaeology. It would also mean studying statistics and population genetics in a very serious way. And I had intended to go back and do formal studies in statistics, but that has not happened with everything else going on in my life. So I would have wanted to do that. Culturally, uh, I'm limited by the languages that I can use for research. And I have long wished that I knew Chinese. Uh, but we're finding a lot of the world that is in our Carpathian Basin is really a world that stretches all the way to the region that is now Beijing. And I don't have access to that directly because of linguistic incompetence. Uh, I wish that I knew Arabic for a variety of reasons. And with 25 years, if my brain worked the way it did when I was 18, I might have been able to add to those. I would try to overcome my dyslexia. I'm dyslexic. I've been known to misspell my own name and not see it. This has been a burden from my very first book that I wish that I could get some kind of treatment to overcome that difficulty with minute detail, which are very important for a scholar. And that's always been. So my first editor said, "How did you get into this business given your disability?" And it's a good question. Uh, but I think I would also, if I was told I had 25 more years and I had some travel budget, I'd like to go around and listen to younger scholars and see what they're doing and sit in on their seminars. I think that the weight there was a time when France was the center of creative medieval scholarship. There was a time before that that it was Italy. I think right now extraordinary things are going on in Germany, but there may be other places that I should be listening to. So those are just some of the things I would do if I were sentenced to another 25 years of medieval studies.
It's great to hear, and I wonder when we publish this interview whether you will be solicited to come and join a seminar here, there, or elsewhere, just
Uh,
by this expression of interest. I want to thank you very much for speaking with me today. Um, it's we've known each other for a long time. We met for the first time in Cambridge,
yes.
and you were there for an event, and you came to talk to me about the St. Gall project, and I worked with you later on from 2010 to 2012 there, and I learned many things from you, including how to drive a manual transmission Miata.
Yes.
Um, I got to stay in your house when I first arrived there, and Lydia and my wife and I found a place to live. So your generosity, both professionally and personally, has always been something that I've remembered, and your generosity continues by lending your time to this interview. So thank you very much.
Well, I thank you for this opportunity to indulge in a little reflection on my career and what I think I have done at this point. And you should be thanking Georges Duby and Herwig Wolfram and all of the people that my wife and I have simply been trying to pay forward the incredible generosity that we have experienced through our long careers. And I hope that things continue to go very well for you in Montreal and in Canada. And I hope that this little interview might serve as something of use to people whom I don't know, but perhaps someday will. Thank you very much.